So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the Addiction Prevention Coalition, kind of semi-monthly webinars. Today, we've got Brent Bonham with us, who's going to share some of his story of addiction and recovery. And I'll introduce Brent a little bit more formally in a few minutes. My name is Art Wimberly. I'm a volunteer with APC, also do recovery coaching in this area and recovery counseling as well. Part of what APC, their mission is education and communication and connecting people to resources in the greater Birmingham area and throughout the state of Alabama. So these webinars are intended to do just that. We'll have personal story today, and we'll talk about resources. We'll talk about issues and dynamics within addiction and recovery. And as always, we've got the question and answer, the Q&A function up for you guys. So as you're listening, you hear something that brings about a question, please put that in the Q&A. We'll do our best to, one of us, to try to answer that during the time or get you an answer. We may not get to everything, but we usually have enough time at the end we reserve that we can look at those and try to answer your questions, or if you've got some observations, maybe even fill in some gaps for us in our discussion, we'll look for those too. So we'll give it just a few more seconds. We know people are coming on board as we go at this time of day. So we'll give it a few more seconds for people to join in, and then I'll introduce Brent a little bit more formally, and then he and I'll start our conversation. Okay, we've got people coming in now, and we know some will be added. Again, Art Wimberly with Addiction Prevention Coalition. And then my guest today, our guest for the webinar, is Brent Bonham. And Brent is a person in long-term recovery that's come on today to share his story and to talk about education, communication, and resources in recovery. And Brent is a great friend of recovery in the city of Birmingham and in the state of Alabama. Brent is let's see, what could we call Brent? He is a specialist in a number of different areas. Apparently cars, right, yeah. Brent? Yeah, you're a little obsessed with cars. Is that right?
I got a few.
Just a tiny. Okay, all right, and a bit of a food and wine connoisseur, I understand. Is that right?
Absolutely. Even though I'm sober, I've worked in the restaurant industry for 15 years, and most of my sobriety spent in high-end, casual fine dining, European stuff.
Right. Yeah. Which is interesting, and we'll talk about it more later on, because obviously one of the things people in recovery are cautious of is environments where things like fine dining and great wines can sometimes be a bit of a trigger. But I think it's amazingly encouraging that someone has come through what you've come through, and not only just achieve sobriety, but a good bit of freedom to be able to work in that industry and work around it.
Yeah, real 10-step promise. I mean, I write wine reports on a weekly basis talking about how fantastic wines are and what they pair with, and put them on social media.
Yeah, well, that just shows a lot of freedom. That shows a lot of freedom. That's excellent. Yeah, right. Okay, so what I'll do first is I'm going to invite you just to begin to share some of your story. And then as we go through, there'll be some places that we'll pause, and some of those subjects we're wanting to talk about, we'll bring those out. And then we'll also look for some of the participants to join in that with their questions or observations as well. So tell us a little bit about yourself. Obviously you're here in Birmingham now. Did you grow up in the Birmingham area?
Yes, so I grew up in Birmingham, originally from Adamsville, which is near Minor, but spent most of my middle school and high school in Clay, right by Trustful. I still live here today. I'm in Clay right now. Middle-class home, that kind of stuff, pretty not matching what most people would stereotypically think of drug addicts today, but pretty on par for the reality of what drug addiction, and specifically opiate and heroin addiction, look like today. I'm, of course, a recovering heroin addict. I got sober July 27th of 2012, so I've had a little over 8 years now. but saying that it's not one of those things. I got on drugs, and then like I hit a point, and I got some help, and then I got sober, and I've been sober for 8 years. I kind of came to in a hospital, a mental health facility specifically in July 27th of 2012, and with a real hazy recollection of what had happened. And the majority of my adult life was spent doing this, waking up in a jail or like Hillcrest Mental Health or something of that nature, where somehow, some way, something had happened. And I am now locked down in a facility getting sober. Rarely made any kind of decision to go into these facilities. And when I did, I didn't remember them. And this was another one of those. And it's a strange experience being a recovering drug addict. I don't remember a lot of what I did at the end of high school, college, young adulthood. I probably don't remember 70 or 80% of it. And so it all comes back in these like blackout flashes. I might remember a month, or I might remember a day, or I remember short snippets of things. There's no chronological order to any of it. And that's why I kind of like to tell my story in this manner. I woke up in a hospital on July 27th, 2012, and trying to kind of pick up the pieces of how I'd gotten there. And, a whole bunch of really nasty, dark flashbacks over the last year. I'd been homeless for the last year. Specifically, like if you ever go to Brookwood Mall, right? There's 280, you get off 280 and go down to Lakeshore to turn left to Brookwood Mall. I slept there. I begged there. I made the most money I've ever made in my life there. And that's what I've been doing for the last year, and, making a lot of money doing that, and sleeping under a bridge, and every dime and dollar of it going in my arm, whether it was heroin or coke or, some pills, Xanax, something, like just every dime and dollar went to that, occasionally getting hotel rooms, things like that. But for the most part, that was a little too much of an inconvenience, especially towards the end. So I had a hazy recollection of that. And then in the year before that, I've had the longest stint of sobriety in my life after struggling for years to get sober. I mean, basically from the age of 20 till 26, I struggled to get sober, in and out of rehabs, facilities. I think I went to detox 13 separate times. And the most success I'd had before I actually gotten sober, I went to a sober living facility. This one was specifically Any Linked Resources in Bessemer, Alabama.
Yep.
I went through APC, which no longer, the Alabama Psychiatric, APS, that's what it was, sorry. I went through APS originally, which, APS doesn't exist anymore, and they put me there. And I was there for almost 6 months, and I had started working a 12-step program and gotten a sponsor, and kind of haphazardly did those things. And I got a good job, and I bought a $30,000 car with no money, on all, just debt. Best thing you can do is take on $30,000 worth of debt when you're newly sober. And I thought I had things well. I thought things were going well. It seemed to be. But the reality is I wasn't really doing any self-examination. I wasn't really digging and exploring what was driving me to get high in the first place. I had just kind of been fortunate enough to get locked up in a facility and stop. And then, I was in a safe enough environment, and that's what sober living provided me with, was a safe enough environment that I could kind of white knuckle it for 6 months. And the idea there, of course, is that then I would work some kind of program or some kind of therapy or cognitive behavioral 12-step something, and address the underlying issues. But I didn't really do that. And
let me ask you a question. I want to come back to that point in just a minute, because that's kind of pivotal, I think. But one question would be, you talked honestly about the years of trying to get sober, from 20 to 26, that year of sobriety, having that safe place to be. The pivotal. Tell us a little bit about where substance use disorder began to enter into your life, because none of us, I'm a person in long-term recovery too, but none of us sit down at any particular day of our life when we're growing up and decide that what we're doing is going to be a lifetime of addiction. Talk a little bit about what your entree into this was, and how that kind of began to get you hooked.
Well, I mean, so for me, again, this kind of, white, upper middle class family, suburbs, clay, trustful area. I wasn't overly exposed to drugs so much. So for me, I kind of follow that typecast that I shattered my thumb when I was maybe 15. I was prescribed 5 milligram. I don't remember most of high school, but I can tell you this. I was prescribed 5 milligram tabs with 500 milligrams of acetaminophen. I was given them every 4 to 6 hours, and I could not wait to get the next one. And I found myself in this kind of starry daze of euphoria. And it wasn't that problems melted away. I mean, I guess I had problems that teenagers had, but it was something else. And then later, when I was 17, I had a spontaneous lung collapse, which happens in like 1 in 10,000 people. And they gave me IV morphine at Children's Hospital. And again, very much something happened, something switched. And then when I was 18, and I'd smoked a little pot in high school, but I mean, I was not on the path to drug addiction by any means. I mean, I smoked pot as often as I think most people might have drank. Like, it happened once every few months at best. It was never something I owned or possessed. And then I remember my family went out of town. I had a bunch of friends over when I was 18, and we were partying, and they had access to some Lortabs, so they bought me 3 7.5 milligram Lortabs. Again, it's amazing. I remember that. And I took them. I wanted more, and I seemed to have this odd reaction that most people don't have. Whatever amount of opioids I put in my body, I seem to naturally crave more to a kind of dangerous level. And so I tried to get my friends to buy me more. They couldn't. I remember my stepfather had a bunch of Lortabs here. I didn't want to share them. I didn't want anyone to know that I was doing anything wrong. So my first time recreationally using opioids, I kicked all my friends out of the house. I stole from my family, and I ate Lortabs till I passed out and somehow didn't die. And that's a pattern throughout my entire drug addiction. Is I'm seemingly normal and fine until I put opiates in. And when I put any kind of opioid medication in, or street opioid, heroin, fentanyl, anything of that nature, I seem to take on a sociopathic tendency where people around me are but cardboard cutouts that can either help or hurt my ability to get more drugs. And I have no care, concern, or sense of empathy about what happens to them. It's not that I'm mean or aggressive. I just frankly don't give a shit.
Well, I've seen that dynamic. I struggle with some of that from a different angle. My oldest son, who allows us to tell some of his story, had a very similar thing. The very first taste of an opiate for him was like, this is what life is supposed to be. And it began a chase for him to get back to that over and over again. Within a year, it was IV heroin. And a replacement.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, my progression was like that. Like, it was pretty aggressive. So at 18, I took Lortabs. I started UAB by 19. I don't remember college, but I do remember that I was always drinking some form of hydrocodone cough syrup in class. By the time I was in my, like, maybe 19 or 20, I was selling Lortabs. I was snorting Oxycontin. By 20, I was wearing fentanyl patches, snorting heroin. And I think my first time in sobriety, or first time into treatment, was probably at late 20s, maybe early 21. So I literally, I was using IV drugs, and like having drugs like shipped in from Florida and selling them and things like that. I was doing that long before I could legally drink, and I never really drank much. It seemed like a waste of money comparatively.
So you seem to be amongst those percentage of us that can abuse substances, but actually can be a high functioning person during part of that. Is that true?
Yeah, I mean, I was fairly high functioning until heroin. I mean, really, it was heroin and Oxycontin was what kind of tipped it over. But even, I mean, I was working in things. I've held jobs. I worked in restaurants. I worked for my father. I sold a lot of drugs. So I found out later, and this is one of those sad things that like families don't talk about. I found out towards my like around the time I kind of already tipped the scale and started using opiates. My father started warning me that there was a really bad history of opioid addiction in my family. Not alcoholism, not drugs, opioid. And like my father would have open heart surgery and refuse medication. Like he would refuse pain meds post-op and things like that. And I found out I had like a great aunt who got locked up for this. I have a cousin who's now dead from it, from a heroin overdose specifically. That was last year. So you know, there's a hard pattern of this in my life. And like, not only am I high functioning, but like, so a lot of people, when they take opioids, they get real drowsy or nauseated. They don't really function. And that's not how I react to them. I've never reacted to them that way. They give me a lot of energy, almost like amphetamines. Make me real talkative, life of the party, very social. That's the kind of stuff that opioids do to me.
I think, and we watched that in our oldest son too. His for whatever reason, his genetic makeup was such that his reaction to opioids or opiates very similar to what you're talking about. And I think it's very important what you just said about the history in your family, because I think for decades now, we might have come to know that there might be a genetic component in addiction in general. And we tend to think of alcohol specifically, right?
Right.
For years, people would talk about a family history of alcohol, but I think we're just now beginning to understand that the properties of opiates or opioids actually can grab certain genetic makeups in family history as well.
Yeah, one of the people who really helped me get sober was Dr. Charles Smith, and he was not like a doctor who treated me. He was someone who the DEA had taken everything he had because he was writing prescriptions to Elmer Fudd and filling them. But he had gotten sober, and he was in Bessemer with me too, and he now is, studies addiction and all this. But he was explaining to me that some evidence has shown that certain people seem to have a genetic predisposition to be able to process and get more, those feel-good chemicals from certain external stimuli. And so like for my family, apparently it's opioids. And two, I've never overdosed and not without trying. I've never overdosed in my life. I can consume shockingly high, doctors do not believe me, amounts of opioids, and they don't seem to faze me. Like that's like I'm a bottomless pit when it comes to that stuff. But give me a quarter of a Xanax and I'm passed out or doing some belligerent craziness.
Yeah. So do you think the tolerance, because of such a deep level of tolerance for opiates, was that part of the factor where it began to increase your use over time?
It may have been that, and it just seemed like I could always get the reward. Like I would never get so, like some people will drink and they start feeling sick and they're not going to drink anymore. Or some people take Lortabs and they start to feel sick and they don't want it anymore because it doesn't make them feel good. Now, I may physically get sick, but that is not how I feel. I continually feel more and more pleasure, feel better, goes further, goes deeper. There's no end in sight. As much as, when I got bad, I was speedballing. So I was shooting cocaine and heroin, and I'm not the biggest fan of Coke, but you can only go so far down. So I would shoot Coke to go up so I could do more heroin to go back down because I was chasing the fall basically on opioids.
Yeah. So let's come back up to where we kind of diverged a few minutes ago. You were at ALR in Robbie's place, and things are, you got a year sobriety and
about 6 months.
6 months sobriety. And then then it's kind of like, okay, now I'm supposed to do life on life's terms, as the big book would say. But you weren't quite ready even with the sobriety, right?
Well, and so a key, in my experience, a key to sobriety, both in the short and especially in the long term, seems to be humility. And that was something I was lacking. I had this character defect or maladjusted survival instinct that I would try to chase away the fear of being alone by trying to show people how cool and valuable I was. This was something I did when I was on drugs and when I was sober, and I would come across as this arrogant prick and I'd push people away and the fear would be fulfilled. So anyway, the reason I say all that is that the reality of what happened with me was that I relapsed after almost 6 months. And I remember I was giving a ride of some heroin addicts to the store. And I made the statement that nothing can make me shoot heroin today, fully believing that. And then I got a phone call that I'd missed a shift at work. I had to go to get in uniform and went down there. They sat me down. They suspended me for a week. I had plenty of money. Bills were paid. I mean, I lived in a halfway house and I was working in a pretty nice restaurant. My money was not a problem. And I walked out of there, and instead of calling my sponsor, who I had talked to 20 minutes before, I called a buddy who used to get high. I ran down there and I started shooting dope with him. And then once I shot up, something drastic happened. Everything of, I'm just going to get high this one time. I just need to cope with this. They won't know. As soon as I shot up, none of those things that mattered before meant anything. And I entirely changed my perspective to, I just want to get high. Where am I going to live? How am I going to move out of here? I'm going on another run. Nobody can stop me. Yeah. Something switched. A flip switched as soon as I put in. I was talking about how I get so talkative on it. I even went back to the halfway house that night. We had some mandatory meetings, and we had one where we're supposed to read the big book to each other. That's just what they did at ALR. And I went to read the book, and not only did I read, I decided to go on a rant about my knowledge of what the subject matter was. And in the middle of that, I fell out. I mean, literally just lights out, fell out. And I was out just long enough for them to realize I was high. And then I came to, and I finished my point with a smug look of, aren't you thankful I imparted that knowledge on you? High as a kite.
Wow. Wow. So the humility hadn't hit yet, right?
Nah.
Yeah. I always say that the twin pillars of recovery have to be gratitude and humility, and they each feed on each other. So I'm glad you brought humility. But I know in my own life, I was in my late 40s before humility crept in, and I don't even think I know how I got it. It's not, I know I worked the steps, in AA and in Celebrate Recovery and other places, but I'm not even sure how humility got there. And so it makes it difficult sometimes to pinpoint in another person's recovery how to even help them get there, or how do you spot it, or what's going to happen. So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. And I mean, well, and you start to get into the slippery slope about so you've got someone who's strung out on drugs or alcohol, and you want to get them help. And so people decide that they're going to force them to get sober, and they're not at that point for whatever reason, and what that point looks like. And so I know with my family, a fair amount of money was spent on resources. But I went to detox 13 times. I mean, and that first time, that second time, the fifth time, and the eighth time, I didn't want to go.
Okay.
And so a lot of resources were burned up in the process. And then this weird concept came about that I just need to hit a bottom. And when I hit this magical bottom, whatever that is, when the bad enough thing happens to me, I'll decide to make the choice to get sober again. And
now, is that what you were hearing kind of from, not what you were thinking necessarily, but what you were kind of hearing from
that's
the
outside? That's what I was hearing, and that's what everyone seemed to be telling my family, and my family's kind of concept of how this works. And it seems pervasive even in recovery today. Why'd they get high? Well, they just hadn't hit their bottom. They're just not ready. And
I heard that a lot when I got in recovery, and I used to buy it, but I don't buy it anymore. And I love the fact that we're starting to talk differently about raising bottoms and bringing and not interfering, not enabling, but actually not assuming that someone is not motivated. To hear all the time they're not motivated. I said, I don't think we don't have a clue whether they're motivated or not. Motive lies so deep buried underneath that it's hard. We should never judge whether there's motive in there. There really is. I believe it. It just got buried.
It's a shame no one ever wrote a chapter of a book or an essay on raising the bottoms in the 50s. Well, and I think there's a lot of misunderstanding there that somehow they have a choice, and that wasn't my experience, whether it being prescribed to get on the drugs, but now trying to get off them. It was not that I just was having too much fun. And it wasn't that I was just not humbled enough. And as far as my bottom, I think there were plenty of times earlier on. Like the first time my family figured out I was on drugs, my father offered to pay cash to send me to Bradford.
Yeah.
Cash.
Yeah.
I mean, but you know, I had a girlfriend who was 21 and we had infinite amounts of money in drugs. Why in the hell would you go to treatment? And then other times after his death, there would be times when like I've been to treatment 4 or 5 times and I wanted to stop. I really wanted to stop. I was not enjoying this at all. But, you know, it was like, well, it's just a waste of money if we put more money into it. So, you know, my mother was gracious enough to keep my health insurance going. So I had an option when I wanted, but it was, 4 or 5 days in a mental institution. It was not treatment.
Yeah.
And so, how do you spot that with other people? I don't really know, but I think that's something that for those loved ones dealing with, they have someone who's strung out on drugs or alcohol or something of that nature. I think it's more than just forcing them to go or making it bad enough for them. Honestly, a lot of the making me hit my bottom just drove me to a lower point than I may not necessarily needed to hit.
Yeah.
But no one really understood what to do with me at the time,
Yeah. And I know you well enough to know that when you speak about these kind of things, you're not looking for somebody in the family or in the past to blame. You're very clear about that.
Oh yeah. No. Yeah. Yeah, we don't excuse the actions. We don't excuse our actions. It's not that I was a victim. I in no way believe I was a victim in anything that happened. But I think that starts to get into that whole concept about morality, victimhood, people being good, bad, being drug addicts, choosing to do this. What if we applied these same things to schizophrenia, or better yet, type 2 diabetes? You know what I mean? Like, can you imagine if we were like, well, this is your 3rd heart attack. We're not going to take you to the hospital this time. Maybe now you'll hit your bottom and you won't eat a donut.
Yeah.
That's insane. You know what I mean? Or like, well, they stop taking their meds again and they're talking to themselves and can't function as a human being. It's probably best to let them be homeless for a while. Then if we let them slip far enough into their mental illness, then they'll start making the right decision. That's insane when we make an analogous like that. But that's exactly what we say with a drug addict. Well, they've literally just wrecked their brain chemistry. The best thing to do is to push them away and isolate them and let them run for a while until they wreck their brain chemistry enough that they maybe will make the right logical choice.
Yeah, that's a good point. So it puts loved ones, family members, concerned others in a kind of a difficult spot. And just like those of us who have gone through addiction, they really did not grow up and enter adulthood with a book of knowledge about how to deal with the struggle, just like we did, right? So, yeah, so maybe one thought we could talk about was just simply, and this is where it gets into kind of really a lot of nuanced thinking when you're a family member or a loved one or spouse or whatever it is, and you're concerned, is we know it's better now to not just assume that we need to make life worse for the person that's struggling, pushing them toward a deeper bottom per se. But if that's not what's good, what is some different thinking now that you would say, now that you're on the other side of this and now you're the helper sometimes, what are some other things that we might share with folks that might give them a different way to begin to look at things? Not make we can't make the decisions for them. We can't tell them how to do it because not one size doesn't fit all. With all of these things, we're just too different. But what are some things you would suggest to family members to think differently about, or to think about that maybe we haven't been teaching people?
Stop viewing the world as black and white. Right. So for example, what I mean by that is it's not either we continue to enable them and give them as many get out of jail free cards as we can, nor is it, cut them off from everything, shut off their phone, take away their money, call their job, make sure they get fired, call DHR, make sure they lose it, destroy everything worth living in their life. And then they'll, neither way is right. It's not that they're making the decision and at the same time, they're not, everything in their body is telling them to pursue it and keep going with the addiction if they can. So I think the better approach is to ensure we're not enabling them, that we're not, giving them resources, making it easier for them, but at the same time, no intent to make it harder. If anything, I think that for the family and the loved ones, there needs to be this kind of open line of communication, much like in the Cold War. There needs to be that phone. We need to be able to call that when, before we go to DEFCON 1, when they are at a point where they're miserable and things have spiraled out of control and they don't know what to do, that they call. And then when they call and they are looking for the help, that's when you start really looking into, well, where can we get them? And I don't think it means drop an endless amount of money to put them in an extremely expensive facility that day, but maybe get them detox for a couple of days and then start looking at it. What are you willing to do? What do you want to do? Do you want to go get high? And kind of gauge them, because to try to gauge their thought process in the throes of addiction is insane. They don't know. I mean, I don't remember the times my family sat down and tried to convince me to go into I don't have any recollection of that kind of stuff. It happened.
Yeah, so many conversations take place, as you said, while emotions are running high, because in the middle of someone still high, you're not going to do any good when, no matter how well or poorly you talk to somebody at that point, nothing's getting through. So detox is huge, especially in the era we're in now with this epidemic with opioid. And it's kind of the resources, it can be tough to find sometimes. If you don't have insurance, detox it takes a little bit of scramble to get there sometimes.
Yeah, and so that's a lot of what I do is I specifically surround myself with and fellowship with a lot of heroin addicts. And so we deal with this person needs help. They want treatment. They don't know what to do. And in the past, and this was still true today, how this was true in quarantine is, okay, well, one of the many ways we can handle this is we can take you to a hospital and we can sit with you in the ER and you can convince them you're going to kill yourself and they might lock you down for a few days and we get you detoxed and go from there. Fortunately, though, there's more available today in Birmingham than there once was. I'm not sure if they still do it, but I'm pretty sure they do. But I know Dr. Hess did a thing with the ER for a while that if people came in with opiate addiction, they could get short-term prescriptions to Suboxone and hooked up with peer support specialists to try to point them in the right direction. You have, the Recovery Resource Center now. You have the Addiction Prevention Coalition, such as yourselves. You have Ross. You have all these different branches that, with Ross and the Recovery Resource Center, you can call them and then they'll put you on to here's, inpatient facilities like Bradford or RSU at UAB, or maybe you don't have money like that. Here's Fellowship House and Sober Living America and, Pearson Hall and the various sober livings, the 40s, the ALRs, things of that nature, or, the various different, 12-step branches. You have things like AA, NA, CA, HA, CMA, Dharma, DAA, well, I guess it's, Dharma. There's all these different things, smart recovery, cognitive behavioral therapy. There's so many resources available today. It's just about finding them and kind of navigating them. And that's kind of what Ross and the Recovery Resource Center provide. So that's who I would tell anyone to start with.
Yeah, I use them quite a bit as a recovery coach and counselor. I'm often using the Recovery Resource Center or Ross or both to try to connect people to resources, even if it's just, like you said, the short term, the gap until something else comes along.
And another thing I would say that for some reason is not this concept and this idea that does not seem to be in anybody's lexicon here. But, at the end of the day, if you have someone who thinks they have a problem and they don't know if they do, they can call hotlines like, I know Alcoholics Anonymous, Cocaine Anonymous, Heroin Anonymous all have hotlines in Birmingham. There is SMART and Refuge, and there are clubhouses like the Jefferson Alcoholics Foundation Incorporated on it's right in 5 Points South. I think it was an AA clubhouse, Bessemer AA clubhouse. The Moore Institute. There are places where meetings are held that if someone doesn't know if they would need help or not, and they want to just anonymously go talk to some people and see where they're at, it doesn't cost a dime. It's not associated with any court system or anybody. No one will repeat they're there. That's what I would tell a lot of these people. So I had a phone call recently, 3 weeks ago. I had a phone call. A friend of mine, she has a friend in college who's apparently been doing meth, and the girl doesn't know what to do. And so I pointed her in the direction of a group of people I think could help and a meeting they might want to check out. And I said, I'm not a member of this. I'm not associated with this, but I do know some people who go here. And I go check out their meeting and just have her talk to some other people there, and maybe they can help point her in the direction of what she needs to do if she wants help.
Yeah, that's great.
Why not raise that bottom?
Yeah, there's kind of this myth, I think, for families and the general public that thinks that there's not resources. Uh, Sometimes you do have to work hard to find them, but they're out there. There are people like yourself and so many others who are ready to spend time and energy to reach out, to connect people, to and try to. It may not, the first place they get them might not always be the place, but that moves them to the next place, and we finally find a place. And recovery works. It really does work, and there's a lot of it there. More people are recovering than we think are, but I still think there's this gap in communication and education about how many different resources are really out there, and
or
how to
like
connect people too.
Or in Birmingham, how established it is. Like, people think this is a small city, or Alabama's in the middle of nowhere, and yet, I mean, Birmingham has one of the oldest, I mean, we're talking stretching into the late 30s, one of the oldest recovery communities in the world. Yeah. And so, I mean, there in central Alabama, there are endless resources and tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people in recovery. I mean, it always shocked, like when I have friends who are not in the recovery community who get to know me and start meeting other people, they start to realize, like, they'll jokingly say, like, it's almost like a secret society or cult, because all of a sudden they realize everywhere they go, there's sober people.
Yes.
So, yeah, we are, there's a lot of us.
Exactly right. And the more those of us that have gotten some freedom and put life back together, the more we can find places to talk about that in the appropriate ways, the more other people can get connected to that need it. So take us back. I interrupted your story when it was fixing to get good. Yeah. And so bring us back up to this point where something shifted for you somewhere. It may not have been like immediately noticeable, or it may have been growing over time and you didn't know, but something shifted that got you on this road where now you just passed the celebration of 8 years. So tell us a little bit more.
Well, so me, it was that kind of moment of clarity, quote unquote, it happened in Jefferson County Jail, but it's not that I needed to go to jail to have it. It wasn't how bad jail was. I wouldn't recommend a stint in Jefferson County if you can avoid it, but it wasn't that. But, you know, I was like the fourth person in the cell, sleeping on the floor. You know, it was 2 bunks in the cell. And something clicked that, you know, I had been in and out of jail probably 6 or 7 times. I've been in treatment or in detox 12 times now. I've been in sober living once. And you know, this last stint, I said, I don't care. I'll do whatever I have to do to stay high. And I begged on the streets and stole and conned people and whatever else I had to do to stay high. And, but I woke up in Jefferson County. I was going to be stuck there for at least a week. I was going to go through full-blown opiate, heroin, cocaine withdrawal. I mean, nasty stuff, you know, no medication. And the click was that, you know, I was at this point where I could either chase getting high as much as I could, not to, because the goal for a heroin addict is not to be dope sick, period. That's it. They're not enjoying it. They're just trying not to be dope sick. And so I could either chase it and not remember all the times I got high until I woke up again dope sick, which may be a week, a month, a year, 5 years later, or I could try to go back to the sobriety. And of course, the sobriety was not just a choice. The sobriety often, for me, to that point, what sobriety had been was I was this spring of restless, irritable unmanageability, this discontent nature that just wound tighter and tighter and tighter until I couldn't take it anymore and I get high again. And like my experience with trying to get sober to that point had been every time I try this, I just go back. Like, I can't stand being sober, and I'm not sure if that's any worse than being dope sick. And so that was the debate. But when I realized I'm going to spend the rest of my life waking up in mental institutions and jails, being forced to go through withdrawal, like no matter what I'm willing to do, I'm going to keep going through withdrawal. The only chance of escaping that is long-term sobriety and being willing to do whatever that takes to get there. And a lot of my hangups to that point was I had always been an atheist. I still consider myself one today. And so the recovery path seems so tainted with, if you don't believe in a God, you can't do it. Yeah. And so to me, it was like, I was really going to have to just throw myself away and see what may or may not come of it. But then I didn't get sober at that point because there was no one willing to take me to treatment. There was no resources available. Everything had been burned up. And so I left jail and I got dope and I got high for 2 or 3 more months. But the other thing that happened too was there was a group started that's really close to my heart that I will not mention. And one of the members who helped start it relapsed and he called me to help him get some heroin. And so we went and got high and he was telling me about this group and it sounded like my people.
Yeah.
Ironically enough, you know?
Yeah.
And so things got bad. I went back to treatment for the 13th time. I woke up July 27th, 2012. I reached out to a manager of that halfway house and convinced him to sponsor me and begged for 2 weeks. It was Robbie Keeble, Tom Braddock, Charles Matzos, and Jamie Martin, who were the owners then. They were gracious enough to let me back, even though I did not deserve it. They gave me that second chance I needed. And because I had done some bad things when I lived there before. And it provided me with that safe place I needed. And I worked a program. I had a psychic change. I got sober. I've been sober since. And to stay sober, I have really sought character building and humility. And I have, personally helped, I'm sure, several hundred people get sober now. And that's not something like, look at me. That's literally been the key to long-term sobriety for me. In quarantine, I sat in the hospital, or I took people to the hospital constantly during quarantine to try to get them sober, constant exposure to COVID because, COVID's bad, but I've seen a lot more heroin addicts die this year than I've seen people die of COVID.
Yeah. And really what you're describing is the outflow of the inflow of the steps, in the sense the 12th step is whatever we've got to give it away or it won't come back. Right. And whether you're a formal step worker or not, that's the core of what happens. Whatever we're given, if we don't give it away, it begins to dry up and our own recovery can suffer. We may stay sober, but we're not as joyous. We're not as powerful. We're not doing what we're designed to do. That is so encouraging, your story, and then you're giving back. And I know you enough just to know, as you said, this is not about you, but it is great to know what's going on with you in your recovery, and that people are getting help because of your recovery.
And one other little thing on that, I remember when I got sober too, there was this concept, and I think a lot of people have this, that I would somehow have to shield myself from things, or, that I would have to be on guard because at any moment, and I can't stand when people treat me this way today. Like if they say the wrong thing or if I'm exposed to the wrong stimuli, I'm just going to go get high and just throw everything away. That's not been my experience. I've experienced this like position of neutrality, this, problem been removed, where, while I'm totally abstinent, I work around alcohol for a living. I work in the restaurant industry. I've been around drugs countless times. I've done hundreds of instances where I've gone and gotten people, thrown their drugs away and taken the treatment without the thought of getting high. And I think the reason I want to share that is just to say that there is something in this recovery process that takes someone who literally cannot stop using no matter how terrible their lives are. Then we provide them with treatment, provide them with resources when they need them, and they do go through this process. They achieve this psychic change and humility, and then they are an entirely different person. They're totally protected from this. It's incredible to watch.
Yeah, it is. That's great. A thought would be along the lines of some of the topics we've been talking about. You mentioned groups and fellowships. AA and 12-step groups were big for me. Celebrate Recovery was big. I love the idea of smart recovery because, especially because they've incorporated a lot of the craft training. And you may not be familiar with craft or not, but craft, I think, is a great addition to the recovery, to facet of recovery that we hadn't done a lot of work in before. And basically, craft training is helping those that are trying to help people struggling with something, where it's parent, child, concern to other like yourself or whatever it is, to actually begin to approach this from the center ground rather than the extremes you were talking about, right? It's either I stay enmeshed and enabling, or I go all the way over here and you're dead to me, right?
Right.
And there's a center. I don't like to even call it the middle, because then that sounds kind of like it's compromise. And that even is not, I think it's the center path,
Right.
which is always the harder one to do. But craft, I think, is a great training in smart recovery of how concerned others can actually learn, get educated on how to stay connected positively without enabling, but still being close enough to monitor to say, this is the moment in which help would make sense and this is what it might look like. It
Right.
gives them a whole different language and thought process of their own to deal with their loved one. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
So
Yeah, I mean, the world's
smart
not black
recovery,
and white.
yeah, yeah. So things like PAL groups that do education, Al-Anon, smart recovery, I think we're starting to add layers to our efforts in this
Yeah, there's
area.
like Nar-Non, H-Anon.
Yeah,
Yeah, there's a whole list of things specifically geared for the family, the loved ones. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. That was one of my entrees. Actually, that's what got me into recovery. And then 2 years in, I actually had to work my own recovery. I came in through like a lot of people, I come through I got tricked in the side door, back door, because struggling with family addiction. And about 2 years in, I'm like, uh-oh, maybe I better start working this
Yeah.
too. Yeah,
Yeah.
which is one of the great graces of my life that happened, actually. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the Moore Center. Great. We had Steve on a couple of months ago to talk about some multimodal recovery, and they're another great friend of recovery and prevention in the Birmingham, Central Alabama. Because, like Steve said, if it's a meeting that'll save somebody's life, they can meet in their facility right there. So great
Right.
givers over there. In fact, tonight we'll do the PAL group, which is Parents of Addicted Loved Ones, at Moore Center tonight at 6:30. So if anybody's interested, if you're out there and you're not just a parent, PAL is not just for parents, it's also for anyone who's concerned about someone that is struggling with substance use disorder. We've got a meeting, and we're back meeting face to face for the first time just a few weeks ago. And we do protocol, safety protocol with mask and spacing, but we're still in the same room. And tonight's a speaker meeting. We've got a young lady coming to share her story, kind of like Brent did today, and then stay with us and let us as loved ones talk about what works better and what doesn't work in that world. So that's one resource there at the Moore Center. There's also a PAL meeting on Monday nights in Shelby County. You can find that on the PAL website or on the APC site as well. But those are just one little piece of it. You got a question?
Well,
Something to say?
well, I was going to say another one that a lot of people are not as aware of unless you're kind of in the recovery community is, of course, like I said, Jaffe, the Jefferson Alcoholics Foundation Incorporated at 2012 14th Avenue South near 5 Point South. They've been open for the last few months, and they're doing full mask, distancing with chairs, all that kind of stuff. They've gone above and beyond, like few I've seen, to really ensure that there's a safe facility for people to seek recovery. So even those who might be immunocompromised and concerned about going to a random church or whatever, that is another resource you can go to right now, which,
a Jaffe meeting, all of that is just like almost world famous, right? Yeah. Okay, so before we got a few more minutes and before we close, so talk to me a little bit about for you, what typically works for you. You celebrated 8 years of sobriety, you're past 8 years, but I know you, and you talked even today about the idea that there's still a program to work. So what are some of the things that you do that you find helpful for you in your recovery?
For me today, my program has really kind of focused on, it's mainly service work oriented, being really embracing that altruistic movement. And not that there's not self-examination, prayer, meditation, that kind of stuff, but most of what I do is, like, for example, in quarantine, I lost my job. I lost a career. I'd worked at a restaurant for 7 years, and it all disappeared. And so I spent most of my time in quarantine outside of taking apart one of my cars, trying to help people get sober in some different facets. One was, when members or their loved ones called me and someone was strung out and didn't know what to do, I would go meet with them and, sneak out through quarantine and help them get to a hospital. But the other thing is, I have a little bit of a talent, not the best, but a little bit of talent for marketing and things of that nature. And so I do a lot of service work for a fellowship, doing like what's called like public information,
Yeah.
and trying to get information out and let people know that there are resources available. And then the last form of service that I try to do is stuff like this. Even though I'm not the biggest fan of telling my story or talking about what I did, but it's to destroy the stigma of it. Like when I had 2 years sober, I was on a thing that WBHM did called the Issues and Ills, Pills to Needles, talking about people like me, went from the pills to the needles, and was there with like Dr. Wilson, Dr. Cropsey. And the whole reason I did that was just so they could have a heroin addict there who was sober and stable and, you know, could have an intelligent conversation and show that we absolutely do recover. We are not hopeless causes, because I think that's what a lot of people thought then, and maybe even still think today.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I love the way because I imagine if you're like me, your recovery work has shifted and nuanced over time. But I love the way it's morphed into, at this season of your life, one of your biggest things is giving back, as you said, the altruistic, being in the middle of helping, and how that actually helps us as addicts not just stay sober, but actually mature as well. I think that's something that people sometimes don't understand. The goal of course is sobriety, but beyond sobriety, there's also a deepening, enriching of life and a maturity that can come with that too.
And see, and I think that's where a lot of my concepts of the world's not black and white, or talking about these like the bottom, or is it a choice, and a lot of these kind of concepts develop. These aren't opinions. These aren't things that I've just like watched other people say, and I kind of think that's the right decision. This is from years of working with heroin addicts, sitting with heroin addicts at Jaffe, convincing them to go with me to the hospital, convincing them to call resources, helping them get into facilities, trying to work them through some kind of program to help them get sober today. And you know, really digging both in myself and others for a long time, talking with a lot of family members, helping run hotlines. I've kind of developed a different concept of what this is, and realizing like we don't, I did not have a choice. And that it's not that they need to just hit a bottom, or they need to just be isolated right, or you need to just provide them with enough $100,000 rehab facilities where they can go ride horses and they'll get like, no, there's something more. There's something in the middle. There's that center, as we say.
Yeah, great. Awesome. Good. Okay. So I know we've got one thing coming up we want to make people aware of before I give you the last word. On November 17th at 1 p.m., the first virtual fundraiser for APC will occur because of COVID. And so for you Alabama and Auburn fans out there, we have the lineup looks like this. Former Auburn coach, 2010 championship coach Gene Chizik is going to come and deliver a keynote speech on resilience. Resilience is so big in recovery. Resilience is big in life, period. And a lot of people don't know this about Coach Chizik, but along with the other things he's done and is doing around football, he also, back in his collegiate days, took some graduate work in counseling, and has a great background in that, and a very, very deeply caring person, not only about the players that he coached, but about young people, period, and people moving through phases of life. So Coach Chizik is volunteered to come and to deliver the keynote speech on the 17th at 1 p.m. It's free to sign up. We hope you'll pass the word on to folks. And because we got an Auburn person, we got to have an Alabama person. So Eli Gold of the Alabama Broadcasting System fame is going to come and kind of help MC that. So we had to have some balance there, right? Because we can't overweight Alabama Auburn. So we got them in. So we hope you'll join for that. We hope you folks will tell people about that. Brent, let me ask you something. Do you know of anything in the recovery community coming up? An event, a resource, anything that you can think of this time of year that might be coming that people might want to know about?
No, I know, yes and no. I know a lot of the groups, a lot of the 12-step groups like to do like holiday parties, things of that nature. I know that like there's a Heroin Anonymous group that always does Dirty Santa sometime in December. I know a lot of the CANA groups do a lot of things. It wouldn't surprise me if someone needs a place to go if during the holidays because I mean, the holidays are very hard for our people. Traditionally, people would go to Jaffe or like the Bessemer AA Clubhouse. I don't think Jaffe's going to do the massive food spreads they used to do,
Yeah.
but they will be open. And then another kind of new resource that's come into the scene would be UAB's CAPI. It's the Center for, like Pain and Addiction Institute or whatever, but it's a new research facility that Dr. Cropsey and them are heading up, and I'm really excited to see what they do. And then, one we didn't talk about that they generally do stuff like Ross and them is the collegiate recovery community of UAB. It's a subset of UAB that's specifically geared to try to provide a safe place for those in recovery in the college campus. But they always do a lot of stuff. Like every 4th of July, they'll go watch the fireworks near Red Mountain. So they're another one I would look to, Ross, and just that's the thing for those, like, the holidays are hard. Being with family is hard, especially those who come from families that drink. I would reach out to these various facilities and, groups and see what's coming up. I know one year we did a heroin and tacos with one group. So, and it was just a taco party with a bunch of recovering heroin addicts trying to get away during Father's Day. But there's always a group there. There's support somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned collegiate recovery with Trent Boozer and those folks. Do a great job with that, and it's newer. It's come out in the last decade, and people are not aware. And with a big in Birmingham, of course, we've got a big collegiate communities because of the universities and colleges around here. So if folks if you're in college age or a college situation right now, around a university or whatever, and you're looking, please contact us. We can get you to Trent and his people at Collegiate Recovery. And one last thing, and then we'll close it out. I'm going to put you on the spot here, so you can say no. Okay? So if somebody wanted to reach out to you, could they do that? Is that possible?
To me?
Yeah.
Oh, of course. Yeah. My information's available. Anyone has my express permission to share my personal information with anyone, especially concerning drug addiction, alcoholism.
Okay.
So my cell phone number is 205-901-3735, and my email is my full name, Brent Bonham, it's BONHAM @gmail.com.
Great. And we'll keep that. We've got that here, Carrie and the APC folks. You've been such a resource for them. Last thing, there's a question. I want you to take 45 seconds, okay? What do you think can be done to alleviate the drug stigma to the general public? And we talked about that a little bit, okay? And where would you point the public who thinks that drug addiction is a choice always and not a disease? What are a couple of things you would say to the folks listening about that?
Wow, that's really interesting.
And you only get 45 seconds.
Yeah, right. Well, so on the one hand, I think that a lot of that concept has to be smashed in our new world where so many people were prescribed various medications by doctors for good, honest reasons, and yet they see themselves, stumble into this, into drug addiction and stuff. I mean, we've even seen this with like Parkinson's medications, which have had side effects of causing people to develop gambling addictions, So that's very real. So you can't say there's the same, choice there. And the other one is, I would suggest get close to some people who actually struggle. I mean, sit down and talk to some of these people, go to some of these meetings, go to some of these speakers, volunteer in some of these homeless shelters and really watch what these people are going through. And I think you'll start to see that nobody would choose this life, like to make the decision to try to help someone get off the streets or to help someone get sober, just as a task. You find someone who seems to want to do it, just go do it and see how easy it is.
Wow, that's awesome. What's your favorite book on addiction or recovery? Anything come to mind?
No.
Too many of them?
I'm a purist, and I don't want to mention the book that the two books I so strongly follow, but
okay.
I like the classics from the 30s and the 50s.
I got you. Okay, right. Well, Brent, thank you again for joining us, taking the time to do it today. But really, thank you for all that you are doing in the recovery and prevention community throughout Birmingham. and in the state. And it's a pleasure. And I hope to be talking with you soon. Let us know if there's anything we can do to help you guys, okay?
Absolutely. Thank you, Art. Thank you. It was an honor being here today.
Thanks. Folks, thanks for joining us. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. Hope you'll join us, though, on the 17th to hear Coach Chiswick and Eli fight it out. And again, thanks for being with us. Goodbye.